Thank you very much. Well, it seems to be a pretty long agenda for this evening. I hope everybody had a good night's sleep last night. You may be up pretty late tonight. Everybody feel like working tonight? I mean that actually fairly concretely because, I enjoy talking, but I also enjoy conversation too. So at some point, let me warn you. I'm going to precipitate, or at least I'm going to try to precipitate some real back and forth conversation on one or two topics that intrigues me tremendously, especially nowadays. Well, anyway, start the ball rolling. Wendy, when she rode over, said, Don, well, you always like to have some sort of a central theme to peg on. And so most of us, of course, have heard 20 or 30 times your story about meeting Baba. But some of the people have never heard it, and obviously everything that happens in one's own personal relationship with Baba has its own eternal springtime. So let me go way back into the very end of World War II. And I was one of these struggling young Sufis out in the Bay Area who had been initiated by Murshid Martin, and would go back and forth on the streetcars which never seemed to run on time, and wonder why God and the hierarchy didn't arrange a poor struggling aspirant's life a little bit more readily to make getting on with this internal path a bit easier. On one of these occasions, she said, Don, I'm calling a special meeting on Saturday next weekend for something that's extremely important. And he has an extraordinary sense of smell, that dog does. He really loves odors. He's taking a little more inventory now. So we went over.
You missed that.
Missed it.
Especially perfume.
I thought it was French cheese. I thought I was probably still pretty well loaded with that.
Shoe leather, anything.
Well, we all congregated over in Murshid Martin's living room, and she said to us that ever since Inayat Khan had dropped his body in 1928, that, as was the tradition in the Sufi order, and an awful lot of history in back of that, but we just don't have time for it this evening. She was looking then for her successor as her murshid, as her teacher, the position that Inayat Khan had filled, and that she had come to the conclusion that she had found that individual, that his name was Meher Baba, that he lived in India, was born of Parsi parentage, and I can't remember whether she explained what Parsis were, we knew it, but at any rate, Meher Baba of India, she told us at that point, she was quite certain was the individual who would become her spiritual guide for the future. And she said that she had already been in touch with him in India and had asked him if she would accept her as his murid, as his student, and if he would also accept her order. That she was giving us 2 weeks to make up our mind whether we would follow her as Meher Baba's guide, Meher Baba is our guide, and that on I think 2 or 3 days later in the following week, that there would be 3 of Baba's very close followers who would come to the Sufi school in Fairfax and give us a good deal of the background of Meher Baba. We went to Fairfax, the old Sufi summer school, and Murshid Martin sat on the dais with Elizabeth Patterson, Irina Machabelli, and Mildred Kyle. And Irina Machabelli gave us a a very impassioned address on Meher Baba's self, his stature, his background, her association with him. And we had an opportunity after that to chat a little bit, and then we had a little bit over a week to go back to our respective homes and think it all through and decide whether we would come back and tell Mercia Martin, yes, we would follow her under Meher Baba's guidance, or no, we had reservations and would not. There was very little literature, actually, at that point on Meher Baba. We had a little blue folder book called something about the universe. Can't remember the exact title anymore. Do you remember it, Ned?
Universal Message?
Yes. No, it wasn't the Universal Message. It had some of the very, very early diagrams of evolution and involution in it. Maybe it'll come back to me in a little bit. And I think there were 3 volumes of what was at that time the 5-volume Indian edition of the Discourses. We may have had at that point 50 selections of little messages, a little paperback, but that was the entire literature. So we all delved into this as rapidly as we could and became aware of the fact that this was an individual who had taken a vow of silence, which was a little upsetting to a Westerner's mind, and read some of the things that he said. We can't beat around bushes, and so I just have to be honest with you. This isn't a success story at this point. I rapidly ran across a number of things that disturbed me quite considerably. I mean, why an individual in this busy day and age should take a vow of silence and try to have a considerable impact upon the world's problems was really beyond me. So I floundered around in that for quite some days, as a matter of fact, plus a few other pet problems. And I think 2 or 3 days before the time limit was up set by Mercia Martin, I thought it was high time for me to go back over and lay my heart on the table, and she could make mincemeat of it or whatever she wanted to. But it was necessary to at least start leveling a bit on the subject. So, with great trepidation, because I had an enormous respect and confidence and great sense of the integrity of Mercia Martin, and to be coming back with reservations that represented a questioning, an implication of questioning of her judgment, was very difficult for me. Incidentally, can you hear way back over there? If I start getting too thoughtful and drifting down lower and lower into my chest, why, just say a little louder, please. But usually my voice is fairly carrying. At any rate, I went back over to Mercia Martin's study and sat in the chair where I usually sat in front of her as a murid, and finally forced myself to bring out these points. And she listened very patiently, I suppose, for 10 or 15 minutes. And then finally she met all of my problems with just one very simple statement. She said, "Don, how can the drop possibly try to measure the ocean?" Well, this is actually quite an old classic statement from ancient mysticism. She may have leveled it at me before, but I really realized that this was the heart of the matter. And yet at the same time, I also realized that at that moment I was sort of stuck with the problem of the drop really trying to measure the ocean. How else could I get through this problem that she had posed to me? So, at any rate, it was very obvious that she was not going to sit down and go into a great, tedious, intellectual dissection of this whole matter. Bless her heart, I mean, a great mystic doesn't concern themselves with that sort of an effort. So I had to go back, and I spent about 48 more hours with myself. And I finally decided that actually the drop could not measure the ocean. The only thing that was possible was my intrinsic faith in my spiritual guide, Mercia Martin. And if I had complete faith in her, then automatically there was absolutely no question of my questioning her own judgment. If she was ready, after all of her experience, wisdom, and life, a magnificent life, beautifully lived, if she felt that this man was not just, let's say, the normal successor, but she had made it very clear, a magnificent successor to her own beloved Murshid Inayat Khan, whom she loved and revered. This was so obvious. Then what could I do but accept her judgment? So I did it just simply on that basis. I didn't put the blame on her, but when the 2 weeks was up, I simply said, no, I accept him too. I knew inside of myself that there was a whole little storehouse of things that I had to sort out and digest. But nevertheless, the basic decision was, here it was, my spiritual teacher, in whom I had utmost confidence, who had made her decision, had placed her spiritual ongoing and future in the hands of someone called Meher Baba, and this was enough for me. Nevertheless, I had to do some housekeeping, some tidying up. It took 7 long years. This was, as I say, just at the end of World War II. We all got busy, and we'd get a letter about once a week, Murshid Martin would, from someone in Baba's entourage that he was coming over, and then it was postponed, and then he was coming, and then it was postponed. Finally, Murshid Martin became ill. She contracted a cancer of, I think it was a lymph gland in the back, and finally passed away from that. So she never got to meet Meher Baba, her chosen teacher. It was sad, but she had given herself. From the time that she made this announcement, she had me blow up the charts on involution and evolution and the universe and creation, and she taught from those two to the end of her life. Absolutely total devotion. You know, isn't that an extraordinary thing when you stop to think of it? This woman, who was a young woman, had been initiated by one of the great mystics of that time, Inayat Khan, enormous charisma, charm, magneticism, and totally devoted to him. When her new spiritual teacher came, whom she recognized, then with absolutely no sense of negating or downgrading Inayat Khan, then gave her total devotion to Meher Baba. It was a fantastic thing for me to see. So 7 years went along, and I often look back over those 7 years and think of the fact that it was an enormous personal inner experience, in retrospect now, to see the fashion in which Meher Baba took me through successive crises, learning positions, situations in my own personal life, and brought up these various different reservations that I had had about different things that puzzled me. Let's be honest, the silence, that really deeply upset me. One of the first things that began to happen to me was that all of the old ladies up in the Sufi school in Fairfax began to get ill, and the manager of the property got ill too, and there was Stevens in about his mid-20s, who was the only person with any energy around. So I got saddled not only with my own job at work, but trying to keep that institution running and nurses and doctors flowing in and out. So I was getting 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night and absolutely dead on the rail most of the time. And then all of a sudden, once when I was sitting in my office one day and puzzling over a processing report, I found myself just sitting very, very quietly with my feet together in my hand in my lap and being silent, and my assistant Steve Shutt came in and started talking to me about what the chromic acid bath was doing to the aluminum outside, and I just felt I didn't want to talk about the darn thing, and so I didn't say anything to him. And he looked sort of a little puzzled at me and went on back out. I guess Stevens is in a glower today or something of that sort. And suddenly this idea of silence sprang up in my mind. I thought, well, gee whiz, I wonder if there's anything to do with psychic energy or things that need doing. And and silence. Well, I don't pretend that this is why the avatar maintains silence, but, you know, from personal experience, a little tiny bit of a breakthrough, the barrier cracked through. And I actually found that when I was absolutely, totally exhausted, physically, emotionally, psychically, that if I were just silent for a while, somewhere or another, the old Stevens batteries managed to start recharging, and I'd get back up to a point where I could at least begin to function a little bit. Well, as I say, this undoubtedly has nothing to do with the rules and regulations of avatarhood, but nevertheless it represented a little bit of personal insight into the question of silence. I began to think of Baba's silence with a little bit more interest and respect. For 7 solid years, various different types of things went on. Some of the things that I questioned in relation to Baba solved themselves totally. Some of them, let's say, went into neutral. And then finally, when in 1952 the word came over, Baba's bought his tickets, he's bringing 4 Mandali with him, and he's arriving in New York on such and such a date, came through, I found, looking inside of myself, that this whole background of housekeeping that obviously had to been done had actually been pretty well cleaned up. This was one of my first experiences of the manner in which the avatar fulfills this job, how he knows what's going on inside of you, what has to be done, and how he goes about cleaning up the things that have to be sorted out. You know, this is the fantastic thing about this business of an avatar, the individual who's in charge of creation. The fact is, he really does know. And the second thing is that he is so much more perfect a workman in charge of a job and a problem than you and I have ever seen. But his standards are absolutely astonishing. So it's been a while afterwards that I realized the thoroughness of the job that he did in that 7 years period of time. But very, very, very typical. So here we get to, let's say, a day in the springtime of 1952, and the word has gone out that Mayor Baba, as a matter of fact, you know, we didn't run around screaming Jai Baba or Jai Baba and Avatar Mayor Baba. There were only a very small, limited number of people, a few of the Mandali, that Baba had said anything to at that time about avatarhood and being the avatar. It was, you know, here was a great, certainly a perfect master. But all during the early part of his ministration, Baba did not particularly claim to be this or that or the other thing. And it was rather late in his ministration that he came out rather flat-footedly and just simply said, I'm the avatar. I must say this quite honestly. So, at any rate, here is going to come this great spiritually developed individual by the name of Meher Baba. And after 7 years, I really felt that at least I was up to date within myself, and I felt happy about the vow that I had made. Incidentally, he made us all take a new vow, which was somewhat modified from what we had previously taken. And one of the difficult parts of it was absolute honesty, which set us all a bit into a tizzy. But that's another story, too. So, he was arriving in New York, was going to go down to Myrtle Beach, where that magnificent person who many of you have had Baba's grace to know, Elizabeth Patterson, had built the property at Myrtle Beach to receive him. Then he was planning to come on out to California, to another property that had been devoted to him at Ojai, called Mayor Mount, just a little north of Los Angeles. And if we had the ability, we'd go out to Myrtle Beach to see him there, and then see him again in Ojai. And because I was employed in a business, you know, where at least I felt you had to make very careful plans about vacations and let your bosses know well in advance, and you had substitutes, and I was in research chemistry and one of the 7 octopi of international oil at that time. You had to be very sure that there were people to back you up in the laboratory to be sure things didn't boil over. I didn't think that I could get to Myrtle Beach, but I was certainly going to see him in California. Well, bless him. Midway across the continent, of course, there's an accident and breaks a leg. Well, that's sort of startling in relation to the avatar. why didn't he see around the corner and see the car that was coming in the wrong direction? But, you know, I mean, after all, it was a terribly distressing thing. But they were all taken back in an ambulance to Myrtle Beach and recovered, and then an alternative occasion was set up in New York. So now we get down to the actual incident. But I want to point out to you just once more, and forgive me for doing it, it's the way my mind works. You know, superficially, on the surface of this story, here is Stevens going through all of his gyrations and mental cogitations, and is it this or is it that, and I don't feel comfortable about that, and so on. And it's a pretty self-centered, egoistic story from that standpoint. This is the way we think. This is the way we live. We live inside of our own shells. But I realize now the careful, challenging, providing of information, providing of living experience, bringing up to date, unsorting of knots from one's own internal experience that the Avatar led me through. So, the scene is not of Stevens trying to think through his things, but really Baba knowing exactly who I am. What are the important hang-ups that I've got? Working out the learning experiences so I can get ready, get to the point where instead of coming before him with a whole barb of bristly antagonisms, that at least I can meet him neutrally. This is what he had done to me in 7 years. I'm ashamed to say it took that long, of course, but it did. So, New York. Well, he was going to be there over the weekend and for 1 or 2 days after that. So I went into my boss, and he knew me modestly well. I don't think there were more than 2 or 3 people in all of Standard Oil, California, who knew I was a Sufi. Nobody knew that there was anybody called Meher Baba from India involved in the whole thing. But 1 or 2 of them did, and I said to my boss, I'd like to have the weekend and probably the first part of Monday to go out and see this person who was the head of our order now. And he was very cooperative. You know, really, you'd be sort of surprised about how elastic and human some of these moguls can be. At any rate, he was very cooperative, and I got on the plane on a late Friday afternoon. This was still in the old propeller days. We sat down in Chicago overnight, and I got into New York early on the Sunday morning. Baba was in Mercer Deduce's home Saturday to receive people there. I tried to do a little shaving with my electric razor over in a friend's apartment. Went over, buzzed on the door just off of Central Park West, where the Deuces lived at that point. And Charmian Deuce, Mercer Deduce's daughter, came to the door, and we're old friends, and greeted me warmly, and said, well, Don, there are 3 or 4 people before you, but would you like to go up to my bedroom and just sit quietly? And I saw that in the living room, in the salon, which is a lovely big 2-story, rather imposing reception room, there are quite a few people milling around. Oh, I'm not a terribly shy person and not especially super sensitive, and normally I enjoy being around chattering with people, but to my amazement, I appreciated Charmy's sensitivity, and to my surprise, I thought, yeah, it'd be sort of nice to be a little quiet before going in to meet Meher Baba. So I trundled up the stairs and went into the bedroom, and there were a couple of gals there that I knew, and they were sitting over by the window. And when I went in, instead of coming over and greeting and chitter-chattering, they just said, hi, Don, and they went on chatting, and I sat down on the edge of the bed, and waiting for this event. 7 years waiting on it. As I sat there, and I guess feeling a bit dopey after being on the plane overnight, and I wasn't especially thinking about Baba, to tell you the truth. We'd had some pretty tough personnel problems in the laboratory, and I was wondering how under the sun either to fire this guy without getting in a mess, or to avoid firing him and to avoid the messes that I knew would still keep cropping up. And all of a sudden, I felt sort of strange in the throat. Oh my God, I picked up a bug on that darn plane. There must have been somebody in the plane who had a cold, and it's passed around to me. You know. So a little worrying about that, and I went back thinking about this personnel problem, and all of a sudden I thought, gee whiz, my throat really feels very, very tight. Then the whole thing began to pile up on me. For some strange reason or another, this began to transfer up into my sinuses, and my eyes began to water, and I thought, for pity's sake, what's going on? I think I'm going to cry. And, you know, I wasn't upset about anything. I wasn't thinking about Baba. All of a sudden, I remembered a story that it very often happened that when people first met Baba, all of a sudden they broke down and cried uncontrollably. It just suddenly flipped back in my mind, this story, which I thought was sort of a sentimental old wives' tale. Forgive me for using these terms. I hope they don't shock you, I just have to talk honestly with you about how I felt and the things that went through my mind. I felt things like that were, a little bit loony, over-sentimental. But here, suddenly, this remembrance of this effect, and I thought, well, but this is impossible. I haven't even been thinking about, but I haven't even been in front of him. It can't have anything to do with that. And then all of a sudden, I thought, my God, I'm going to start bursting out weeping. And what are those two girls going to think over there that I know? And what sort of stories are they going to tell? You see, old Stevens' ego here, wondering what the effect is going to be when all of a sudden, here's a guy who's supposed to be a scientist working in a research laboratory in a petroleum company, sitting on the edge of a bed and doing nothing, and all of a sudden he starts crying. Wouldn't that be a ridiculous story? I was so embarrassed with the thought of it, that I looked over to see if they were looking at me, and did a little bit of wiping of one or two tears away, and I thought, my God, this is going to be the scandal that's going to really flip me. Did my very best, and I got a little under control, and I thought, well, I'm going to make it after all. And about then, one of the girls looked over and smiled, and then went back talking. All of a sudden, it hit me about twice as hard, and I thought, God, I'm really going to burst out, And my chest started to heave, and really, you cannot imagine the extraordinariness of a sense like that. When nothing like that is ever, I'm a double Capricorn. You don't do those sort of things. So at any rate, by some miracle, the second great crisis was past, and just about that point, why Charmy opens the door and says, Don, Baba's ready to receive you. Followed her down the stairs, and still feeling absolutely so disoriented and ashamed and mortified at this unexpected emotion surging up, that I followed her down, and my mind was just sort of seething around up here. I wasn't even thinking of Baba at that point, but what a crazy thing to happen. So she went through the living and over to where a double door going into a little library was, and opened the door, and in I went. There was a chaise-longue. Remember, Baba had broken his leg in the accident in Oklahoma. His leg was still in the cast. It was propped up. I think it was the left. I think that was the way it was worked out. And he was stripped to the waist, had on a very light sadra, which was folded down, and a bucket of ice, a tub of ice with a fan in back of it. And in back of the fan, funny little gentleman with a red hat, who turned out later to be Gustaji, who had also taken the vow of silence years before, smiling away and smiling, Baba sitting there, and three other Indian gentlemen surrounding him, Harshidadus, I think one other Westerner, can't remember who it was. Baba looks at me and smiles, and then immediately beckons, and two of the Indians come to him, and he stands up. It absolutely crucified me to see Baba with his broken leg go through the gentleness of standing up. I mean, You know, I mean, it just absolutely broke my heart. With a broken leg, who was I, for heaven's sake, to command this sort of gentleness? I mean, way beyond anything which we would do in Western circles. I started to protest, but before I could protest, Baba smiles and props his cast leg on the floor and starts gesticulating. And who was it? I don't know. Couldn't have been Gustaji, could it? He was in a vow of silence to one of them. I think it was Adi Sr., who was the interpreter at that point. And so Adi Sr. Reads out the first words that Bob is saying to me. What does he say? You know, my first name is Don, D-O-N. And so Baba says, so this is Don. We have been together since the dawn of time. Well, double take on that one, you know. I mean, how touching to have been with this great individual all of that length of time. Gee, I'm pretty good stuff to be around such an individual over that long a period. But my other reaction was, gee, that was a pretty corny pun that he pulled on me. So it was my first little introduction to Baba's sense of humor. I don't think he ever pulled another pun on me, though. And I didn't know what to say back. What do you say if somebody says we've been together since the dawn of time? Well, gee, weren't those apes lovely in those times? Or what did you think of the mastodons or something of that sort? You know, well, it was so... I never got over being dumb around him. Every time he would say something sweetly or humorously or gently to me, and I would search through all the crannies of my mind to try to think of something hopefully amusing or maybe just slightly intelligent to say back. I'd just sit there like that, you know. Poor old Baba, he'd always have to bear the brunt of all of the conversation that went back and forth. So it was about 5-10 minutes that this went on. And I can't tell you what all went on. I do know what went on inside of myself, because when I did leave, I realized a couple of terribly important things, crystal clear, and the most important things that have ever happened to me. First thing I realized, and there was no question at all about it, and it was easy, and that was that in all of my experience of being around human beings in all of my life, and I feel a number of extraordinary human beings, none had come within even a tiny anthill of measuring the height of this individual, of his inner being, of his development. No question. An instant recognition. You say, well, how could you know that without sitting and chatting with him for 2 or 3 months? You don't ask yourself a question like that. You just know. His quality was so instantly manifest and apparent. The other thing that was equally apparent and of extraordinary importance, and this is one of the functions of the avatar, I'm sure, in our lives, and that was to know that he knew me totally. I didn't feel that I was naked or transparent, simply totally known to another individual, and the incredible part, totally accepted by that individual. Not with sort of, well, you're sort of a naughty boy, sort of tolerance at all. Not at all. Absolutely 100% accepted in every atom and every item and every detail. And you know, when you're around an individual of that caliber and you find that sort of acceptance, it makes you ashamed of your own shame of yourself, your own unwillingness to accept and to go on in your own life. An extraordinary, necessary thing, I think. Immediately, those two things were established, and I was absolutely so floored by them that I couldn't concentrate on what poor Adi Sr. was translating in the way of gestures. I feel ashamed of myself not to have preserved this for posterity, the first great meeting, except for that pun line. But those were the two important things that happened in that first interview. Well, after that, then, finally, Baba, with his very nice deftness, and sometimes he's more direct, sometimes he can give you a poke in the ribs to let you know when it's time that things have gone. But in his nice, gentle, deft, diplomatic fashion, then it became evident that it was time for me to get on and for somebody else to leave. And so Baba said, well, now, Don, we have met each other, and of course we'll be seeing each other in Harmon tomorrow morning to talk about Sufi affairs. And I sort of came back to life and concentrated on the immediate and began backing out of the door. And I don't know what sort of imbecilic mutterings I may have made at that point, but I backed out of the door of the study, and there he was, and Gustaji still smiling in back of the ice bucket and the fan, pushing away on a little bit of cool air on that hot August sultry day in New York. Well, I went back out into the salon in a complete state of dazed befuddlement, and so, I don't know, was it Charmy, was it somebody else said, well, Don, we'll make arrangements to go up together to Harmon. I said, well, do you mind if I just sit here for a while? No problem. So I went over and sat underneath a window on a bench some way, somehow. It was getting close to lunchtime. Around lunchtime, I wandered out, and I think I had a sandwich somewhere. Sort of vaguely registers. Then I wandered back in, and people were streaming in and out, meeting Baba for the first time, and I just sat there. A lovely thing, once in a while somebody would come by and say, hello, how are you? And then they would go on. Nobody tried to strike up a nice, pleasant, polite conversation. Oh, you're out from San Francisco, and so on. I just sat there, and about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, all of a sudden, study doors open, Phyllis Frederick comes out and says, Baba's going to tell a story. Absolutely wonderful. So, here I was going to get to see Baba already, and I just suddenly realized that obviously that's why I'd been sitting there. Of course, might be a possibility to see him again. I didn't even know that I had a desire to see him again at that point, just instinct was taking over. There might have been 10, 15 of us in the living room at that point. Here's Baba, still on his chaise-longue, pointed over roughly towards the windows over there, and Gustaji was a little red hat in the ice bucket and still smiling and so on. And so Baba indicates that we're to sit around him in a semicircle. Well, actually, I'm a bit shy. I'm less shy now than I used to be, but in those days I was modestly shy. So I didn't want to put myself right in front of Baba. I thought that'd be presumptuous, even though we had been together since the dawn of time. So I put myself rather up in back of him. In fact, when he was looking at the beginning of the circle, I was absolutely, totally behind his head. Baba begins to gesticulate, and I've had 2 or 3 people repeat to me the story that he told, and I can't remember it to this day. I can't tell you the story that Baba tells. Mercer Deduce gives it in How a Master Works, so if you want to read it there, but don't ask me for it. So here I was, sitting back here in back of Baba, and watching the gestures. Well, I've been around, really, some of the world's great storytellers in my time, and I know their techniques, and I know how they capture an audience. And to see the fashion in which Baba absolutely, totally gathered the attention of those people, fascinated them, the beauty of his gestures. Yes, someone was translating his gestures, but it was the grace and the manner, the delicacy of the telling of the story which created the entire atmosphere. Superb. Here I was, and Baba gesturing and turning his head, this magnificent manner. He'd catch this person's eye and catch that person's eye, all of these beautiful little manners of making you feel the directness of his relationship with you. Incredible. You know the master is working when you see this sort of thing. And all of a sudden, involuntarily, I started to raise my hand with my fingers in this position, signifying the circle of perfection. And just as I started, involuntarily, without thinking, it was so beautiful and so perfect and so complete. As I started to do this, Baba in his gestures leans around and he interrupts his gestures, telling the story in a very graceful fashion, to repeat the gesture to me. Well, I thought, oh, how lovely, how charming, just like a symphony, flowing out. Well, Baba goes on telling the story, and suddenly I thought, well, that's a little strange. Very, very good timing that just as I start to raise my fingers in the circle of perfection, that he turns around and catches it out of the corner of his eye, because remember, I'm about 120 degrees off of his direct vision. So, it wasn't just automatic and natural, it was a nice little coincidence. What's that beautiful phrase that Elizabeth patterns? A little Baba happening, I think is the way she would put it. A little Baba happening. But then, here was I'd been a graduate in chemistry and a minor in mathematics, and I'd been fascinated by mathematical probability. And just some odd months before, I'd done a whole series of very erudite thought concentration experiments based on mathematical probability and had some absolutely god-awful, earth-shaking results from that, So mathematical probability for all of these reasons and associated with avataric happenings was right fresh in front of me, and gee whiz, I was really curious. I'm going to see whether that was quite the coincidence that it looked like it was. So, I buttoned myself up intellectually, and I decided, well, I'm going to try this one again and see what he does. Isn't this awful, treating the avatar that way? But, this is so typical of how we go about these things. But anyway, that's how I went about it, so here we are. So, I decided this time when Baba was looking way over at the far end of the crescent semicircle around him, I'd catch him real good this time. And so he was looking way over there, practically out towards Central Park area, if you could have seen it through the window there. And directly off, I was right in back of his head, right here. And so as he was looking directly there, I bring up my hand again, and rather quickly turns right around, does the same circle of perfection back again. So I thought, well, mathematical probability, there's no way he had to have eyes in the back of his head to do something like that, obviously. So that was absolutely charming. So then I watched I was so happy to see that I had proven my little mathematical experiment to myself and had shown that this is one of the powers that he had. I watched him as he continued on his little story. And at the end of it, everybody, happy and smiling, and Papa, that was a wonderful story. And we went out, and I decided, well, I'm still going to stay on. It was getting late in the afternoon. Along comes 5, maybe 5:30, and almost everybody is gone. The door opens. I believe it was Sarosh then, is wheeling Baba out, wheeling Baba out, wheeling Baba out, wheeling Baba out, wheeling Baba out. Remember Sarosh, great big husky guy, and Baba down in front of him like this, a little sliver of a shadow in front in his wheelchair and squeezed in by the arms, and Sarosh is wheeling him out to the elevator to go down, to get in the car, to go up to Harmon-on-Hudson. And so, all of a sudden, I thought, the trouble with a scientist is, after he's proven something to himself, he has to reprove it. And then sometimes he has to reprove the damn thing. And it's ridiculous business. But anyway, I guess that's the way we were built by the Avatar himself. So I decided, well, I'm really going to see whether that was extraordinarily a coincidence after all. I got right back in back of great big old burly Sarosh here. I'm walking along, and here's Baba in front, and Baba's looking towards the front door, and they're starting to open it, and there's the elevator out there that he's going to go down all of the scene of the crimes in front, and Sarosha's as the big screen to it all. And so, what do? Well, this is even worse than number 2. So I start to raise my hand in front of my nose behind Sarosha's back. Poor old Baba. What does he have to do this time? He puts his left elbow on the arm like that, and he twists himself way around like that, looks over Sarosha's shoulder, and does the circle back to me for the 3rd time, But just to, to pamper old Stevens and his crazy ideas about what he thinks he needs to know or prove to himself or have a response. I don't know what sort of thing I was trying to do. But anyway, 3 times he comes back and just to pamper me. Well, I felt so touched and so undone and so bemused, I let him go down the elevator without trying to pull any more pranks at that point. That was too much. The next day, Harmon on the Hudson, Mrs. Deuce, Charmy, Adi Sr., and I were there. We discussed certain Sufi matters. Now, here we've been dealing a bit with esoteric things. Golly. Esoteric things, but there we dealt, first of all, with some certain financial problems. To me, it was extraordinary that an individual who is, by all counts and all admissions, a magnificent spiritual individual, could bore into financial problems quickly, deftly, with a few very careful, very sharply directed questions, get to the heart of the matter, say, did you try that? What about so-and-so? And in the period of 5 minutes, matters which had been discussed and frothed about for months before were deftly clarified, and then acutely keen suggestions made. Then Murshid Deuce had some extremely interesting philosophical questions to pose, very abstruse ones. Baba very simply went to the heart of those, dispensed with those, and about that point, then he immediately turned to me and said, Don, you've got some questions. Well, you've heard these old stories, people always go to Baba with questions, and then they get there and they're too bemused to ask their questions. It happened to me. I had in my wallet 5 questions that I'd carefully noted down on a little piece of paper, and I had it all ready so I could pull it out so I wouldn't forget any of these earth-shaking things that were so important to me. When Baba said, well, now about your questions, Don. He didn't know anything about my questions. I knew about them. And I said, oh, no, Baba, I don't have any questions. Don, yes, you do have some questions. Oh, no, Baba, I don't have any questions. This Alfredo Gaston thing goes on back and forth for 2-3 minutes, and finally I admitted I had 2 questions. And so I was still reluctant to bring up my 2 questions, and Baba says, well, you want me to throw out Mrs. Deuce and Charmy? Oh, no, that's not necessary. So he threw them out anyway. And I still wouldn't ask my questions. And so he said, well, what about Adi Sr.? Shall we get rid of Adi? And I thought, oh, my God, how will I read his gestures? Then I won't know what he's saying. And so I said, no, that's not necessary. So I asked my 2 little questions. He said exactly the things I was afraid he was going to say. And I thought in my heart, my God, how am I ever going to bear the answers that he's given to me? The end of that story is, it was absolute duck soup, the things that I'd been dreading for years that I might one day have to end up doing. It didn't bother me the least single bit. You're going to say, well, it's the Avatar, but he also taught me something at that point. When you finally get done all this fuddy-duddying and tripping over your shoelaces about things that you dread, and finally you go ahead and do the necessary, even if the Avatar isn't there egging you on, when you finally make the decision and do it, it isn't 1/10 as bad as all of your imaginings. He taught me that in about 2 seconds at that point. So, anyway, that was enough. Then, a little later that afternoon, he came back up to the Deuce apartment. We had a final session with him, and I went off in the airplane. When I got in the airplane, of course, pretty well filled with Baba for quite some time. Came down to Chicago, refueled, took off again. as we took off again, then of course we're getting closer to San Francisco, scene of the crime, personnel problems, money problems, friend problems, you know, you name it. All the usual problems of life. And I started thinking about those again, feeling just a little bit ashamed, but I knew that it was Monday was going to be there fast, and I was going to have to put up some sort of a front or a pretense of knowing what I was doing. And so first of all, I plugged into the personnel problem. God, there was an answer there I'd never dreamed of before. I thought, gee whiz, I was pretty stupid not to think of that one. So then I thought on to the next one, personal finances. You know, in one's mid-20s, who's ever got enough money? You know, I mean, everything is in a blessed red deficit. And I didn't see the answer to my big deficits at that point. For some strange reason, it didn't particularly seem to worry me. And then I went on, you know, I just sort of went through an inventory of my personal problems and pet peeves. And as I went through them, I began, you know, this old business of mathematical mind. Isn't that sort of odd? I mean, gee, I seem to see a surprising number of things I didn't see before. And where I don't see a solution, I don't seem to be all upset and perplexed by it. And this then was the outcome, as far as my own personal practical life was concerned, the meeting with Baba. And I thought, well, I wonder, is it possible that I'm so bemused and so amazed by the presence and the impact of this man that for a while I can't be worried about these things. They're too mundane and too superficial. But then, as the weeks and the months rolled by, I really found out, this little story I've already told many times, and it's in the introduction to God Speaks. The amazing thing is, in some fashion or another, Baba had clipped a very fundamental nerve response to worry. And I could never, after that point, become involved in this type of worry where your intestines, your stomach, your esophagus all get involved in the thing you know. You get tense and tied into the middle of it. So that was the first meeting with Baba. Wendy, there it is. Much longer told than originally expected. Well, let's see. Gee, we've been going quite a long time. What time did we begin? About 8 o'clock, wasn't it? I tell you, there was one thing I wanted to toss out on the table, but I think maybe it would have to be a little bit a short version, but I think it's such an important question that at least I'd like to broach it. And to me, the subject is entitled Baba's Inner Guidance. Just a very simple little question, you know.
You can answer it in one word.
What's that?
Faith.
Faith. Mm-hmm.
What was the word? I missed it.
Faith.
Faith. Mm-hmm.
You don't got that, you don't got nothing.
Well, I'd written down two parts of that question, and I'd like to read them to you, and just see what your reaction to. Ned hits a terribly key word in the whole thing. The first part of the whole problem was, number one, now that Baba is no longer in the body, what do you feel the basis of our relationship with him can be? Okay, you know, that's pretty important. I don't know how many thousands of young people that I've run across around the world who are deeply attracted to Baba. Just about as soon as we get to know each other, they say, oh, well, but, you know, you were one of those lucky people who was alive and got to India and America to see Baba, but we don't have that. We missed the boat. We've got to wait 700 years until he comes around again. And so I think that this is absolute.
This is what astounds me about all the people that didn't meet him, because remember Baba used to talk about 100% conviction. Having met Baba and question a second, you know that story. I got what I think is 100% conviction, and faith goes along with that.
Mhm.
But how about all these people who didn't meet him? How do
Sure.
they get it? That's what I'm
Yeah, right. And that's what they keep tossing on the table. So I would just say to the whatever number of people sitting here in the room, if he isn't in the body, are you clipped short? Do you have certain small resources that are left? I mean, what do you feel about it? That's question number one. And question number two then gets a little more to the heart of the thing. Do you feel it is possible for him to continue to give us inner guidance? And if so, what is our responsibility in interpreting this guidance? And by God, that final part of that one, I really would like to challenge us all on it, because I feel we have an enormous responsibility and an enormous amount of judgment that needs to go into it. Now, I'm not asking these questions just rhetorically and then I'm going to expound on what I feel. I feel these are good, working, day-by-day laboratory problems that we're all involved in. Because of the fact that the Muirs and the Foots and Don and the Haynes, Connors who are here got to meet him, doesn't answer those questions. I mean, for us too, he's out of the body now. What the devil goes on? How do we follow? And what are our responsibilities as to how we follow? We're all in the middle of the soup pot together there, really. We've got to find out the same answers that people who never met Baba. Maybe we have one or two more clues, but by gosh, we've got the same questions staring us in the face. This is the important part. Can I read question number one again?
And number two.
And number two. Oh, we're not going to neglect number two. Now that Baba is no longer in the body, what do you feel the basis of our relationship with him can be? What is it? Some books? The Mandali who remembers wonderful stories? Or is it more than that? Really, what's it get down to? What's the potential for Baba relationship?
Well, if you love Baba, you get the answer.
Ned, I'm going to hold you until the last because you know too many answers.
Sorry, I will.
Yes, please, Cheryl.
Keep quiet.
No, I just found, because I just came to Baba like about 2 years ago,
Mhm.
so I'm going through that sort of thing of I never had any chance to see Baba in India or anything. And I just find, having met a lot of people who, you know, like Kitty Davy and Delia and you and other people who met Baba, and they talk, for me Baba is a much more sort of universal thing. And I think that when I first came to Baba, I was very fascinated by what Baba did day to day and reading biographies and that sort of thing. But for me, Baba's taken on a much more sort of universal, much more sort of God and the beyond and that sort of thing. And I was just reading something today that's interesting, like how do you get Baba, this sort of being where you're not even sort of trying to model your life on his or on things, maybe not on things he actually said, but it's the sort of thing where, you know, people are talking about how do you get like intuition and what is intuition.
Mhm.
And I think it's you really just use your mind and you decide things for yourself, and when they feel so right and you feel so honest about it, that's when Baba is guiding you, and it's not just your ego saying, well, I want to go this way or that way. When you can just sort of sit down and feel totally honestly and at peace with the decision you've made.
All right, well, now we have a very important first offering suggestion on the block that when you have an internal sense of deep rightness and peace, this has to be Baba guiding the situation. Do you agree? You disagree? Or where do you feel there's some weaknesses? Because this is a terribly important point. What's your judgment point as to whether it is or isn't Baba's guidance?
Actually, you hit the nail on the head. It really is the process of intuition. I think Baba says that God speaks, or not God speaks, he says it in, I can't remember which one it is, the voice of God's the voice of intuition.
Well, you know, he also says at the same time that he's bringing up intuition, he is also talking about the necessity to be intelligent, to use judgment, to use one's head. And in many places after he's gotten done damning intellect, he points out that the really perfected individual is the one who balances the two. So let's also always remember the balancing that Bobby insists on, that it's not just intuition.
Well, I think that not to get off an intellectual discourse, but
Mhm.
that's what intuition is, a balancing of the internal senses.
I think it's
Well-
the intuition that finally leads you to the decision. The intellect, you sort of bouncer things around, this is the pro, this is the con, and you think everything out, but it's the
Mhm.
intuition that finally gets you to actually say, this is right.
So-
It's beyond the sort of juggling things
Mhm.
around.
Now, I hope enough of you know me well enough that when I pitch into something and challenge a person, it doesn't mean I'm mad at them or that I'm trying to say that they're wrong. But you know, these things are so terribly important that we can't be superficial about them. So I would just have to say, really, how do you know when it's a sound intuition, or really when your own ego pattern is involved in the thing? After all, I get terribly happy and balanced and satisfied when my ego is very satisfied. I have to admit that to myself. And I suspect other people are not too different from myself.
Well, I found it kind of interesting listening to you describe it as Baba being universal, because for me it was just the opposite. It was trying to get God out of universal into personal. And I learned things the hard way. Peggy always talks about it. I learn by making mistakes. I very seldom sit down and intuit what I should be doing. I just kind of plunge blindly ahead, and when it doesn't work, I go, wow, I wonder what that means, and sort of ferret it out from there, what I'm doing wrong and why it isn't working.
Let me ask you right there a blunt question. Where do you think Baba's involvement, right in the middle of a day-by-day practical situation, is? Is he somewhere there? Is he nowhere there? Or is he everywhere there?
He's teaching through everything all the time.
You feel he's everywhere, even if you're blowing your nose, Baba's involved in that?
Yeah, he's there.
I don't.
He's
Mhm.
everybody that's talking to you is him. Everything that's happening to you, he's teaching what you need to learn.
All right, so you look at it, teaching in enormous detail in day-to-day living. What do you all think about that? Do you think he's crazy, or do you think maybe he's got a point? Or do you think he's half crazy when he says that? Again, please forgive me with these blunt words, but...
I thought it was kind of crazy when I first thought about it. I really thought, yeah, God knows everything, but he's not all the time involved with every little thing you're doing. But if you ever try to, like you said, you try to fool him, try to think a thought that he doesn't know.
I tried once or twice, but I didn't get far.
No, I tried the same kind of process. In fact, it's just sort of funny, but the first Bible book I ever read was Listen to Humanity, and I was very moved by that story that you told tonight. And in the process that I came to of just believing, for me, believing in Baba was actually believing he was everywhere all the time and really knew. And I tried that same thing you did, only watching a movie. And the first time I ever saw a film of Baba, that's the first thing that went to my mind is, okay, God, if you're really there, look right at me right now, show me. He just stopped. And, I don't know if it happened for anyone else watching the film, but
For you, he stopped.
Looked out at the screen and said, hi. Whoa! And I went through, and about 3-4 minutes, 5 minutes, I've got a real analytical mind, and I went, he could have just turned at that point
Sure.
in the movie. And I thought that, I said, show me again, just stopped again, looked right at me, I said, all right, enough, you win. And I think I've probably gone through that testing process, more often than I like to admit, but
Sure.
every time I do it, he's always there. And after a while, you just realize that, you can't take him by surprise, he's always looking back.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's just stumble along and
But with your sense of his intimate participation and intimate detail in daily life, this is the essence of what you're saying. What do the rest of you feel? You see, I'm going to let the rest of them challenge you. I just say, what do you feel? Is this realistic, or is this reading too much of a poor old busy avatar into the middle of, how can he look after a few billion people in that sort of detail? Andy? Don't get too far with us, though, Andy. You know too many things, too.
I think we have to remember that Baba said, I am whatever you take me to be. If we try to if we try to crystallize one person's heart feeling about Baba, and another person who might, one person who feels that faith is the most important factor, then it is so. Another feels that the manifestation of love by Baba's grace is the answer to everything. It is so. So I think we have to remember what Baba said, I am whatever you take me to be. So mankind has always gotten himself in a sweat because one person is always trying to convince another person that his aspect, his understanding, his feeling about God is right and the other fellow's is wrong. So whatever you feel in your heart about Baba is right for you, and that's all that matters.
Thank you. That's beautiful.
It's ridiculous. Religions have, we know all the history of religion. People have fought wars and all the rest of it because one person was unwilling to understand that there isn't any one road, there's no one viewpoint, there's no one attitude to find him. He said, when I drop my body, I will live in the hearts of my lovers, and I will go from heart to heart. So the intellect is what we've been using all of our lives, and that's why we've been screwed up all of our lives, because we haven't let our heart have its say. That's all I have to say, Don.
Okay, well, that's plenty, Andy.
Yeah, I agree very much with that. Baba dropped so many clues and things that he said. One thing that comes to mind is say things that you would not hesitate to say in my presence, do things, and so forth and so on. And that could be a key, for instance, to many people. I think it is to me to some extent. By keeping that in mind and keeping him as a constant companion, so to speak, in whatever ways we devise for that, he can really constantly be telling us, are we doing the right thing, are we doing the wrong thing, what should we do next, because we can tap and communicate with him. It might be...
What do you mean by that? You mean
might be
now?
Looking at his picture, a picture that looks directly at you. And I think a lot of us have experienced this. There are times when we just felt like putting a handkerchief over the picture or something so we couldn't look at it. And just a feeling in a certain circumstance comes over one that it's saying yes or no, do this or do that. Or seeing him there, or hearing his silence and what's coming through there. There are many ways.
Well, let's take off from one of your points then. What do you generally feel here? Is it possible, now Baba's not dropped the body, is it possible to tap Baba now meaningfully, alive, organically? He's dropped the body in some way or another that has real energy, real significance, real possibilities for internal guidance. Now, for an individual, let's say, who wants to, who feels drawn to it, to follow Andy's point. Another individual, their meaning, their reality may be something totally different. But suppose you, for instance, say, every time that I read something about Baba, every time I look at his picture, I just have this tremendous need and drive to be really in the presence and under the spiritual thumb, the guidance of Baba. Is that possible these days, or is that an illusion? And if the person thinks that that's happening, they're just about ready for the loony bar. All right, this is a terrible... Andy? Not yet, please. No.
I'm showing great respect.
I'm sure you are. I am too. You can't imagine. Please.
I think what you're saying, it's interesting. I think that it has to be possible to maintain any sort of real personal relationship with God, because if you look just in the past at people like St. Francis and stuff, who, although Jesus wasn't there physically in the body, I mean, I just couldn't discredit the experiences they had and the fact that their life was so I mean, so purely dedicated to this sort of the way of Christ at that time.
I think this is a terribly important point because Baba himself commented deeply before many of us here on St. Francis when he named the 4 great Christian tradition saints and pointed out that of those, St. Francis was the one who, because of his deep love and of his sense of relationship to Christ and his love for Christ, achieved perfect masterhood, the only Westerner who has yet done it, 1,000 years after Christ had dropped the body. So this just has to be from Baba's own direct mouth. Ned's going to burst a button if we don't.
No.
Ned, I thought you were waving your hand. I say.
I don't want to say anything because
I think we'd all
it
feel
becomes
pretty.
a-
Sorry, go on then.
I think I probably tend to oversimplify it. But in the end, it becomes a question of what you know is right and what you know isn't right, and you know it. And it's just that simple. Just like, what does he say in the last paragraph of God Speaks, you know? You can beat this question to death, and what's coming. In the end, you have to decide for yourself, how are you going to figure out what you ought to do and what you shouldn't do? And no, it's not.
But there's a lot of figuring sometimes in that.
Sure, but I think if you keep quiet and think about it, the answer usually comes, and you know it's the right answer. Now, don't tell me how you know it. But I do know it, and I don't say that I always do it. And when I haven't done it, I get in a lot of trouble. No, that's it.
So Ned votes on the score that when you finally get there, you have a deep internal sense of the rightness of it and the peace within yourself that this is right. You were just about to say
I was going to
something.
say, I mean, it would be pretty hopeless if we felt that we couldn't have that kind of, experience.
Yeah.
That I don't think any of us would be interested in following Baba because we haven't met him if we didn't
Sure.
have some inkling that he's going to keep. I mean, because I am not a very, well, I guess Erich once told me the story. He said, please don't be the kind of Baba lover that, if Baba has to tie your hands and your feet and take you on board. Well, I happen to be that kind of Baba lover. And he does that. And
Yeah.
he just, and for me, that's where I get my faith is just that, I don't do that much, but he's just like constantly pulling me and showing me,
Sure.
that he is paying attention.
You're hooked on the line and he's pulling it.
Right.
Yeah. Could I just offer 1 or 2 suggestions to you about, let's say, forgive me, these are going to be hopelessly, brutally intellectual propositions that I'm going to put before you. But I want to put them before you. It takes absolutely no stroke of the imagination to be absolutely convinced of at least a couple properties of what avatarhood has to be. First of all, the avatar, from everything Baba has told us and every mystic tradition tells us, the avatar is in charge of creation. He's it. And forgive me for repeating an old phrase, he's the chairman of the board of creation. It's under him. He's got all of the lines and the vice presidents under him. He sets down policy, and he's in intimate charge of it. The second thing that certainly doesn't take a great stroke, but maybe it's a little bit more confusing, and that is that if what Baba says about creation being imagination, when the avatar is freed from the imagination of creation, and in perfection he must be, then he also has to be freed automatically. And we know enough in science nowadays to know this is true, that therefore he is absolutely beyond time and space and bodies. He is not limited by them. So this whole business of he was, he is, he will be is meaningless in relation to avatarhood. Therefore, when he dropped the body, is meaningless, absolutely meaningless. He is just as intimately present now as when he was in the body and before he was in the body. All of that has nothing to do with the situation. So, The property of perfection just has to be that he can function at any point within the illusion of creation, that he has any mind to at any time. So the chairman of the board is eternally present. So certainly within all of the principles of perfection, you and I right here have to be just as immediately under his thumb, potentially, and you can recognize it or not recognize it, or enjoy it or not recognize it, but that is a fact. He is. So those are the two hopelessly intellectual things I want to toss into the pot, because I think they are basic to it.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Is Baba the name for the avatar in this particular incarnation, and it's applicable to our reference to him in this incarnation only, or is there some further addition to God insofar as, since he's taken this incarnation, we're now referring to God as Baba? In other words, is Baba the reference to a chronological advent of in this age of the avatar, as Jesus represents another advent, and Mohammed and Buddha, and that God is really, that Baba is, we're referring to this as physical association with his body, or does it go beyond that?
Sure. I'd like to say I think our very best exponent to answer that is Charles Haynes. Charles, why don't you take over?
I don't know why.
Because we communicate that way.
No, I just, I was telling you not to turn it over to me.
So, all right. No, I was immune at that point.
I was enjoying so much.
Yep, now you got to work, boy.
Question, and then I thought, well, Don's going to just say something
Yep.
really perfect.
Yep.
Neither one of you did that.
Well, my feeling is that whenever, one thing I'll throw in, something Elizabeth said, it's always to say, whenever someone would talk about Baba dropping the body, she would, or especially when I would, she would gently remind me very quietly. She said, well, you mean when he dropped the physical body? And that always struck something deep in my heart, because she felt that Meher Baba was more alive than ever after 1969, and she didn't say it or feel it because she wanted to make people feel good who hadn't met Meher Baba physically, but because that was her experience. And that, just to reinforce what you were saying earlier, the eternal presence of the avatar, who cannot leave, can go nowhere, because if the avatar did, there would be no creation, there would be no universe. There is no link between reality and illusion without the God-man. The names he gives himself, of course, are extremely important, and in that sense I feel that yes, he has given us the name for our true self in this time, and that is a very, very precious gift. And my feeling from what I've gathered from Baba is that he gives that gift in love and can only be received in love. Therefore, as Andy was saying, only in the heart can the name Meher Baba be heard and responded to. Not the words Meher Baba, but the name Meher Baba, which is more than the words Meher Baba. It is the echo of our true self. And when we utter Meher Baba, we are saying something of ourselves that we've never been able to know, and that we would have no inkling of if he hadn't taken a physical form and jolted us awake to ourselves in this time. The physical form was so precious and great because without that form there is no awakening. The name cannot be spoken in the heart. And once he leaves behind that physical form, that reverberation of the awakening in the heart is just beginning. His life as Meher Baba is just beginning. And we are living in Meher Baba's life now, more than those of us who were with him physically. I feel this is Meher Baba's life, because this is when the reverberation of his name is speaking in depths of the heart. So the name Meher Baba, yes, is now the name that our self knows itself by. And when we hear that name, we are guided inwardly to ourself, by ourself. And that is always possible in every age, in every moment. But at this time, now, is most possible, because this is his life, when he's most present and most alive.
Thank you, Charles. I will repeat the second question, and if you will forgive me, I do want to say just one thing, and then I know the night is unexpectedly, at least for me, gotten quite late already. So, second question, you remember, do you feel it is possible for him to continue to give us inner guidance? And there's certainly been an awful lot of statement already. Yes, absolutely. And then the second part of that question, if so, what is our responsibility in interpreting this guidance? And if you'll forgive me, and one can only speak from his own experience and convictions, I feel that this is becoming an increasingly important point. Baba did say to any number of people, I was present on a number of occasions, when he would say to individuals or groups, individuals who were missing Baba more and more as he went more and more into seclusion, individuals who had had access either directly face to face or at least by letters or cablegrams, who were saying, but Baba, you have given me guidance. I would ask you what I should do here and what I should do there and so on. And Baba would say, don't worry, I will guide you internally. Again and again, Baba would say that. But while Baba would give, let's say, a magnificent principle, then the actual working out in detail with the practical challenges and problems, then is when he would really work with us, with all of us, in day-to-day life and teach us the principles. And I see so many, many times, especially in recent months, the manner in which Baba is bringing up in individuals who are sincerely, deeply, lovingly, honestly trying to find internal guidance. I keep seeing the challenges. One type of plaint that many people tell me is, I pray to Baba, I open my heart to Baba, I look to Baba for guidance, but I don't get any answer. What does Baba want me to do? I've still got the same problem. Now, don't everybody jump in and say, well, obviously this or that or the other thing. This is statistically a tremendously important problem. Another, on the reverse end of the spectrum problem, and this is the one that worries me more, frankly, than the simple admission of, I don't get the signal. That one, I think, is a very honest answer, and I don't get worried about that. But at the other end of the spectrum, I see on occasions now, and increasingly, individuals who feel that their step-by-step actions are being internally, directly guided by Baba, and that therefore they assume a sort of Baba infallibility in those actions. And this, I feel, is unfortunately the seeds of what I call fanaticism. And I go back to really dozens of times when I've been sitting somewhere in the background and a Baba lover would come to Baba and say, Baba, you appeared to me, you said this to me, you did that for me, you cured me of this, you cured my uncle of that. And in only 2 instances did Baba say, other than that, no, Baba did not appear to you, Baba did not cure you of that, Baba did not do that for you. Your love for Baba did so and so and so and so. But in other words, Baba did not intercede in your lives. And this, I think, is terribly important. This I know because by Baba's grace, I saw how many times, statistically, he denied direct intervention in the individual's lives. So guidance has to be on a different principle. I think we have a tremendous responsibility to open our hearts. But remember, one thing Arish said to me just after Baba dropped the body. I got to India the next day, talking about various things about what aspects of divinity Baba utilized. To my all knowledge, all power, all bliss. All right. Arish said, well, all knowledge, yes, certainly. Baba always knew everything. This I could also corroborate, even from my own little experience. Nothing that I do, no tiny little old nasty stinky thought went through Stevens's tortuous mind that Baba didn't instantly know, and the worst of them, he'd say, Don, what are you thinking? Try to catch me from it. All knowledge, yes, 100%. All power, not very much. He had it accessible, but he utilized it even less than Jesus Christ did. All bliss, no. The avatar doesn't use all bliss, because then how can he really participate in the sorrows and the pains, which is one of the things that he comes to help us with. So all power, no, he doesn't lead through with God's power to push you to do this, to make that decision for you and so on. Why otherwise would he browbeat and push the Mandali so unmercifully to make decisions and do things well? Remember that. So I wish we could have talked a lot longer about that one, because believe me, this one is coming front and center. I tell you it's coming front and center. It is a big challenge, and it is terribly important that people do not inadvertently begin to adopt a base of fanatical action within the conviction that they are being step by step guided by Baba. He doesn't work that way. I know it. So I think that you usually have a silence. So shall we sit quietly with Baba?
I did.